Okay, so in our second lesson in this unit, we're going to look at economic well-being and taxation. So in this, what we're really looking at is to understand how taxes actually work within a market economy to get a better idea of what's actually happening. And then that'll allow us to look at well-being, and then from there we'll look at, like, for example, payroll taxes and how those actually affect us and who's actually paying for those things. So, welfare economics. It's the study of how the allocation of resources affect economic well-being. So we want to make 2 points here. Buyers and sellers receive benefits from taking part in the market. We receive the benefit of the good, they receive the profit. The equilibrium in a market maximizes the total welfare of buyers and sellers. And so total welfare is maximum economic benefit. So how do taxes affect the economic well-being of market participants? Do taxes distort that total welfare? Do taxes distort the maximum economic benefit? To begin with, it does not matter whether a tax on a good is levied, meaning placed on buyers or sellers of the good. So in other words, the first thing to understand is we don't care. We know if the tax is placed on buyers or on the firms, and you should know that, but in terms of overall, how's it going to affect economic well-being, it doesn't matter. And the reason is pretty simple. The price paid by buyers rises. So if no matter what, if the tax is a sales tax on consumers or it's an excise tax on producers, the price paid by buyers rises, the price received by sellers falls. In other words, a tax distorts economic benefit. It reduces maximum economic benefit because it increases the price that consumers are paying and reduces the price received. In other words, reduces the total revenue of the seller. So when you look at it, when you look at tax, you look at consumer price, and you look at total revenue. So what we're saying is, when we look at the money, as taxes increase, the price for consumers increases, and the total revenue for the producer decreases. So this is what happens. Now, it doesn't matter where that tax is placed. If it's placed on consumers or producers, this is what's going to happen every single time. So from the standpoint of economic well-being, it doesn't matter who the tax is on, it's going to affect both groups. Okay, so how do taxes change the market? So 2 important aspects of taxes to consider. Who's the tax placed on, producers or consumers? That's important because it tells us the type of tax that we're looking at. The next question will be who bears the larger burden of the tax. It's what we call tax incidence. So if you see that word, basically tax incidence is referring to who's paying the larger portion. So if a tax is $1, who's paying more of that dollar, consumers or producers? So with every tax, consumers and producers each end up having to pay a portion. So it doesn't matter if the tax is on the producers or consumers from a tax incidence perspective, because both are paying for it. Now, where it gets important is if you have a tax that's supposed to be on producers, yet consumers are paying the larger portion of it, then we have some problems. And so depending on the elasticity of supply and demand, a tax on the firm may weigh more heavily on the consumer than the firm for which the tax was intended. Now, that's an important thing to think about, because when you are developing economic policy and you're looking at taxation, if you're creating a sales tax on consumers that affects producers at a higher rate than it does consumers, then policy may not be correct. So that's where this comes into importance, and we're actually going to look at this in a graphic form a little bit later as we get into it more. So let's start looking at taxes on consumers. What we're more commonly used to is sales tax. So taxes on consumers cause the demand curve to decrease by the amount of the tax. So here's the demand curve. Here's our supply. So most common consumption tax is a sales tax, and that's what you're used to paying all the time. Sales tax here is 9.75%. So you can just pretty much automatically calculate this out and figure out how much you're going to pay plus taxes. If you just added 10 cents to the dollar, that's the easiest way to do it. So to make our example easier to work with, we're going to use a dollar amount. We'll say $1. So our original equilibrium, you'll notice the price is at $3.80. So demand falls by $1. Now, what I mean by that is demand is literally just going to drop straight down by $1. So we're not shifting to the left down $1 of supply. Rather, the curve itself is literally down 1. So that's 280. So when the demand curve hits that point, that's where we stop. So the new equilibrium price is 340 right here, because that's where supply and demand with a tax have intersected. So when you look at the graph right now, here's what you see. You see that the equilibrium price failed. Now, for consumers, we're going to see a higher price. But for the producers, we can look right now and say, okay, producers will receive $3.40 for every good purchased. We can look down and notice where equilibrium is going to be. We already know, just looking at now, we know what total revenue is going to be for the producers. So the quantity was 4.6, which is right here. Now it's 4.2, which is here. So you can see from a producing standpoint, the firm will receive $3.40, and it's going to be 4.2 is going to be the amount that's going to be consumed within the market, which means, of course, that the price that consumers pay is going to go up. So with the tax, firms produce 4.2 and receive 340 per item. But that is not what consumers pay, though. You'll notice consumers pay above equilibrium at 440, because you see how the red line goes all the way up to where it crosses and then it hits where it says D1. That is what our consumers are actually going to pay. So here's our wedge that we talked about. So there's a wedge being created between what a producer is receiving, which is the bottom number, 340, what the consumer is paying, which is the top number, which is 440. So you'll notice there's a dollar amount between them. So that's the tax. So if the consumers buy something, the consumers are going to pay $4.40 for it. The government will get $1, and the producers will get $3.40. And that's how this sets up. So when we break it down over here, so price consumers pay rose from 380 to 440, so it rose 60 cents. Producers receive 340 and total revenue falls. And the quantity falls from 4.6 to 4.4. Dag nabbit. So what I want to do is look at the same thing, but we're going to look at this a little more detail then and add a few things into this. So we'll go ahead and establish our supply and demand in the market. And this is a market for the quantity of bottled water, so price and quantity. So you'll see the quantity with no tax is 500 bottles of water with a price of $5. And so that's our equilibrium with no tax. Now the question we're going to ask here is, if the government were to place a $2 sales tax on the bottled water, what effect would that have on the market? So it's a sales tax. So it's going to affect the demand curve, and it's going to cause the demand curve to fall by $2. So in other words, if we just move straight down that dotted line from 5 to 3 for quantity, then we're good to go, because that puts us at that $3 mark. So the result of a $2 sales tax on bottled water causes the demand curve to shift down by the amount of the tax to right there, because that's the amount of the tax. Now, what that does, of course, is creates a new equilibrium with the original supply line. So the price of bottled water is going to rise to $6.20, and the quantity is going to fall to $3.90. So up here is the point at which those two intersect with demand. So when you look at this, you have to go up above the new equilibrium, because consumers pay above that amount, because they're paying that tax above that amount. Now, that amount between equilibrium and that point there is not going to be $2. It can be any amount in between $2, and it's entirely dependent on how elastic the curves are, and that's something we'll look at. So that's the quantity with tax is $3.90. So without tax, the quantity is 500. With tax, it's down to $3.90. The price at the top is $6.20. And as a result, the seller receives $4.20 per bottled water. So at this point, we're equilibrium of D1 and S. That's the new equilibrium with tax. And then the supply line, we see there, they're receiving $4.20 at that $3.90. So notice what's happening here. So consumers are paying $6.20 while sellers are receiving $4.20. So there's your $2. So what separates the price of consumers and the price that firms receive? It's the amount of the tax. So when you look at where the lines come across and you see that, what you see is a wedge that develops. So the revenue for the government is the amount of the tax multiplied by the quantity with the tax. Well, we know the amount of the tax is $2. So this blue shaded area, this wedge that's created between the consumer price and the producer income, that blue shape right there, that area, that's tax revenue. And that's the amount of the tax, $2, times the quantity with tax, which is $3.90. So that's the amount of money the government would make on the revenue from the tax. So the revenue is equal to the amount of the tax, $2, times the quantity sold with the tax, $3.90. So total revenue is $7.80. But is it really? There's also a deadweight loss that occurs from the tax, this here. A deadweight loss, this is important because that deadweight loss right there has already been produced. It's been produced and the company can't sell it because of the taxing, and they can't get rid of it. There's nothing they would do. In other words, they have to eat the cost of it. So the reality is the tax revenue is going to be the government's, and it's the price of the amount of the tax times the quantity with tax. Where what the sellers are receiving is that low bottom price where demand and supply intersect. That's their price times the quantity with tax, which is $7.80, but they have to take that and subtract deadweight loss from it. And that's the thing, is you have to look at that and you have to understand that they are going to have to subtract deadweight loss from their total revenue. So in other words, it causes profits to go down for the firms. So let's look at elasticity and tax incidence. Remember that tax incidence is the burden of taxation. Who's paying the burden of it? Well, you might think that because it's a sales tax that the customers are the ones paying the tax, but that's not exactly true. The reality is that it's shared, and you can see this by looking at this inelastic demand with an elastic supply. So when demand is inelastic and supply is elastic, you can see here that taxes create a larger tax incidence on the consumers than they do the producers. So if in this example, 3 to 4, so $1 is the amount of tax that the firm pays of this total tax. Whereas the consumers pay the entire top block there. They pay the whole rest of it. So you can see how that breaks down with elasticity. You know, the fact that elasticity for one is different from the other creates this situation. When we look at it from the other side and we flip it and we say that demand is elastic and supply is inelastic, then we get the reverse situation. So when supply is elastic, then tax incidence will be pushed on the burden of the producer more. So you'll notice here in this situation, the tax for us is only $1. But I don't even know, like if you're looking at this right now, you can look at it and say, okay, so they're paying on the left $1, and then the consumers are paying, let's see, $1, $2, $2.50, let's say. So on the right over here, we'll see that the consumers are, let's see, 6.5, 5.5, let's say 80 cents. So then that means that from $5.80 to $3, so $2.80 of that tax is being pushed towards the firms. How would that affect their production? Are they going to reduce production? Are they going to cut costs because of that tax? Are they going to fight it in the government and try to repeal the tax? So there's a lot of interesting things that come out of looking at and saying, okay, how does this tax affect the market? And specifically, who in the market does it affect the most? Okay, so let's look at deadweight loss. So deadweight loss is a fall in the total surplus caused by a market distortion, something like, of course, a tax. So in a market with no taxes or no prices, the market is at equilibrium. There's no deadweight loss existing. But when the market is distorted, a gap develops between the equilibrium quantity produced and then the quantity consumed with the tax in place. So when we're looking at this graph here that we did earlier, you can notice that we've got the two red lines drawn down, and that's to represent the original equilibrium quantity, which was about 4.7, and the new, which is about 4.2. So what we're looking at then is a surplus that firms are unable to get rid of. And that's the big deal here, is because of where the tax is located, firms aren't going to produce above that amount. But when the tax was created, it reduced it, so current supplies were there. So now the firm has this current supply of toasters that they're unable to get rid of. So they basically just have to consume the debt in this point. So you look at that triangle, that's where they're looking at in terms of what they have to assume the cost of. It's the amount of the tax times the difference in quantity. So it's the amount of the tax times the difference in quantity. So it is dead weight. It cannot be used. So they consume the cost of the dead weight loss, thus reducing total revenue. So let's look at how that works. So the original total revenue was equal to 380 times 460. So that's 1748. And that is the original D1S1 where the blue line is at. Now, when you throw a dead weight loss into it, though, and you throw in the tax shifts or makes the demand curve fall. So what's happened here is by creating this tax, the demand with tax has fallen, and you'll notice now a gap's been created there in pink. So see here, total revenue with the tax is 340 times 420 is equal to 1428. So the tax on the sales tax caused producers to have to see a loss in revenue. In addition, that's in addition to paying a sales tax themselves. Now, the dead weight loss on this is 4 times 0.4, so $40, because it's $100. It's a dollar difference in the demand curves, the amount of the tax. At the bottom is the difference in the quantity, which you can see there is 0.4 is what we're saying. So that's 40 cents. So what we actually have to do is total revenue is equal to 1428 minus 40 cents is equal to 1388. So that's what actually is happening to people in the market, so firms. So whenever there are taxes created within the markets, the firms themselves will lose profit because of the fact that total revenue has to have the dead weight loss removed from it. So you can see there at the bottom, the 1428 minus the 40 cents equals 1388. So that is going to be the amount of money that we're going to receive as the company. Then we subtract total cost and hope to make a profit. At the same time, the government's going to take $1. They're going to multiply it times 4.9, and then that'll give them the tax revenue. Okay, so we're going to look at some different graphs and look at dead weight losses and see what's happening. So to begin with, this is what I need you to understand. As tax size increases, the dead weight loss becomes steeper and tax revenue declines. So in other words, and listen to this very carefully, as tax sizes increase, the dead weight loss becomes steeper and tax revenue declines. So let's break that down. So when we see an increase in taxes, dead weight losses increase. In other words, the firm loses more of their total revenue because that increases their dead weight loss. Now, at the same time, tax revenue begins to decline. So can you tax an economy too much? The answer, of course, is yes, because at some point you'll have taxed so much that the tax revenue itself will decline because people won't want to spend. So when you look at it here, a small tax. So when we have a small tax, like what we just used for our examples, revenue is large, dead weight loss is small. So you'll see how much tax revenue there is, and then how much dead weight loss there is. When we go to the medium-sized tax, so with an increase in the tax size and dead weight loss, they're both almost equal now. So on this medium tax, the amount of money that the revenue brings into the government is almost equal to the amount of money that's going to be lost in addition to by the firms. And then you have here. So with a large tax, deadweight loss is larger than tax revenues. So in other words, if you put a tax too high, it will cost total revenue. So there's a curve, just like we talked about all these other things, this diminishing marginal returns, where we can increase and increase and increase, and then it starts to slope in, and then it reaches a high mark, and then it begins to decline. That's the same principle here. Taxes and tax revenues can work along the same factor. As you increase the size of taxes, tax revenues increase. As you continue to do so, though, the tax revenues increase, but by smaller and smaller amounts, until eventually tax size, that number's zero. That a tax is so high that it won't bring any money at all in. Now, if you attempt to try to tax higher than that, then you begin to see a decline in income. So tax revenue actually goes down. So can taxes have a negative effect on spending? The answer to that is yes. And so part of economic policy within the economist and with the government is determining and figuring out what should be taxed, how it should be taxed, and at what rates, so that they don't actually eliminate a competition unless they just absolutely have to get rid of something in the economy. Okay, so we looked at a production tax, a sales tax, on consumers. We're going to look at production now. So here's the thing. There are a lot of different taxes out there. We're trying to focus on two of the most well-known and most used, so that way you get an understanding of the basic concepts of how it works. But when we're talking about from a supply side, usually we see what are called excise taxes, and these are occurring on countries that are usually outside of the United States, and then they of course have to pay to bring in. But an excise tax is pretty simple. It is added to the production of a good. So when we take water bottles, instead of charging consumers an extra 2 cents, an extra $2 when they buy it, rather the price of the water bottle itself just goes up. So they automatically push out an increased price. So here we have demand, here we have supply. We can see our equilibrium quantity and price. So 5 and 500. So with no tax, we see the bottle of water, what its price and equilibrium quantity is. So the question, of course, is if the government were to place a $2 tax on production of bottled water, what effect would that have on the market? Remember, it gets added in to the production price. So instead of being $2, we would increase supply by $2. So it would go from 5, and where it intersects at 7. So the result of $2 on the tax bottle would cause the supply curve to shift up. So there we go. So now we're at 7, and we see where our new equilibrium is with S1 and D. So now you get an idea. Here's what happens when supply has a tax placed on them. How do people interpret it? So remember that the price is built in. So when that bottle of water reaches this point here at $6.20, when it does that, that's the price that consumers are going to pay. So consumers will pay here. They're going to pay $6.20. In doing so, the quantity they demand, of course, will be $3.90. So the price with tax is $6.20. And as the seller receives the $4.20 per bottle of water, right here. So we draw that line, we see what the sellers receive. So now we see the gap once again. Here's the quantity with tax. So because of the tax, the quantity falls. The producers see a decline from original equilibrium to this point down here. So they're looking at 420 with 400 items. So a loss of 100. So that's in that deadweight loss we'll look at. Now, so you have this here, you have your wedge created. So that's your tax wedge. That's the tax revenue. Tax revenue is simply the price of the tax times the quantity sold with the tax in place, which is always that point right there. So the revenue for the government is the amount of the tax multiplied by the quantity with tax. So in this case, it would be $2 times $3.90. So tax revenue is $7.80. And there's a deadweight loss. There it is in red. Remember the deadweight loss, how this is going to work. Here it is. This is what we're looking at. So we're looking at a deadweight loss of basically 1, or in this case 100 times $2. That's what our deadweight loss was. So how does a tax affect economic well-being? Well, now that you know how a tax works and you understand how it shifts supply up, how you have demand down, how they fall and rise because of prices. The next question, of course, then would be this. So taxes raise the price on the goods consumers buy. It also reduces the total revenue of firms. Now, we've seen this already because in the last two examples, this is exactly what we saw. They must consume the cost of the deadweight loss as well. So ultimately, the producers are getting hit twice by taxes. Once because it's dropping the total revenue firm by reducing quantity sold, but at the same time, it's because it's creating the deadweight loss that they're losing a portion of that income, of that total revenue. And as always, anytime the market is intentionally pushed away from market equilibrium, we end up with inefficient markets. Now, why does the government intervene in the market? It's obviously to create equality, or in this case, to generate revenue. Now, it does not matter who the tax is placed on. Doesn't matter. It's easy to figure out. It's important that you know how to figure out that it's the producers or suppliers. But ultimately, when we're talking about well-being, that doesn't matter. What matters here is the burden of paying the tax will fall on the consumers and producers both. So, doesn't matter if we place a sales tax or if we place an excise tax. In both cases, both consumers and producers will have to pay a percentage of the tax. So if that tax is $2, a 50% percentage, of course, would be $1 each. In some cases, maybe the consumer is paying 30 cents while the producer is paying 70 cents. Maybe the consumer is paying 70 cents and the producer is paying 30 cents of the dollar. So we can see that too. Now, the share of the burden is determined by the elasticities of supply and demand. Now, remember, elasticity is simply referring to the slope. So we're talking about the slope of these lines. So it's important to understand the gains and the losses of buyers, sellers, and the government to determine effective policy. Because what happens is you want to know who gained, how much did they gain, who lost, well, how much did they lose? And that's a great question because it's not like you can say, well, the producers lost. Well, that's not true. Producers lost, so did the consumers. Well, and the consumers, and there are just all these different things involved with it. Now, why we need to know that, of course, is because those information will tell us how the government needs to alter to create an effective economic policy, because what the government ideally wants to do is that the tax is created for the group that the tax is created on, that's who actually bears the burden. Okay, total surplus. So the goal here is the maximization of economic well-being. Basically, we want you to be as happy as possible. Now, this is only achieved when consumers receive maximum benefit from the goods they buy. So in other words, we need to, by benefit, we can think of value. So we want the maximum value we can possibly get. Just ask anybody who's taken the time to go through a newspaper and pull out the coupons and cut them out. They're looking for value. Generally, we pay less than what we're willing to pay. And that's what that means, of course, is our benefit, our surplus, our consumer surplus, which we'll talk about, is increasing. Now, producers receive maximum benefit from the goods they sell. Generally, firms sell a good for more than it costs to produce. In fact, if the cost to produce a good increases above what it can be sold for, then the company will shut down production. So, a consumer surplus is equal to a willingness to pay a price minus the actual purchase price. Producer surplus is the actual selling price minus economic cost to produce. So for producers, whatever you're selling that good at, minus whatever people are paying for it, that is what you're looking for. You want that to be as wide a gap as possible. From a consumption standpoint, we want our willingness to pay a price and the actual consumer price to be as far apart as possible as well, because the closer they are together, is the more likely that the good we receive from the benefit may outweigh the cost. Now, total surplus is just simply consumer plus producer surplus. So, consumer and producer surplus. So, consumer surplus is best understood when demand is understood in terms of marginal benefit, which I also remember is value. So, benefit reflects value to the customer. So, if we look at demand in terms of value to the customer, then the higher the consumer surplus, the greater economic well-being of the country. So when we graph it out and we look at it, so here's demand also equaling marginal benefit, i.e. value to customers. So here's what we're thinking about it like this. And you put supply up there, so that line, here's what we're willing to pay. What we're willing to pay is everything from equilibrium to the top of that curve. What we have to pay is equilibrium. So you can see how large consumer surplus would be. When you throw it in and look at it, this is consumer surplus here. So value is equal to marginal benefit. Marginal benefit is looking at demand. So the higher the consumer surplus, the greater economic well-being of the country. Because that means from this standpoint that we're able to purchase goods that have a lot of value at low prices, and that's good for us because then that means that we are having more available money to us. Now, different people have a different willingness to pay for a good. Not everyone is willing to pay a really high amount for a good, and of course we know how that law of demand works, but there are people out there. So what we do on this consumer surplus is it's basically going from equilibrium in a non-distorted market up to where the demand curve ends and down. So for example, if the demand curve ends at number 3, and at let's say 3 on the quantity. So if we were to say that, then we're saying, okay, at $6.50, people will buy this product. But after that, nobody buys anything. Well, then the consumer surplus would be a much smaller triangle. Now, producer surplus is best understood when supply is understood in terms of marginal cost. So if the price at which a good can be sold equals its marginal cost, then it's worth producing. So for every individual increase in production, as long as that continues to equal marginal cost, then they'll produce it. So producer surplus measures the benefit to sellers of participating in a market. So when we put the supply curve up here, that green shadow there, that green rectangle, that is a producer surplus. So both of them meet at equilibrium, and then they work down until the demand line stops, or the supply line stops. So you can see these two. Okay, let's look at total surplus. So in a market with no constraints, the market allocates goods. And we can see, bringing it up, our demand supply curves, where our equilibrium is. So it's to the consumers who value them the greatest. So in a market with no constraints, the market allocates goods to the consumers who value them the greatest. Well, when we look at this, remember we're talking about value, says we increase up the demand line are people who value the product more and more and more. As people value the product more and more, of course, they're more willing to pay more money for it. And this is our consumer surplus. Now remember, our consumer surplus is simply the difference of the willingness, what we're willing to pay for something, minus what we actually have to pay for it. Now, it also allocates goods to the firm who can produce this at the smallest cost. So when you look at that, the least amount of money it costs a firm to produce a good, the more valuable to the firm those individuals are. So resources are allocated efficiently and total surplus is maximized when there's no constraints. Because you can see here, producer and consumer, they interact in the market there at equilibrium. They go all the way out until no more customers are willing to buy. The price is just too high. And as a result, resources are allotted efficiently and total surplus is maximized in this situation. So total surplus, of course, then is consumer plus producer surplus. Okay, so what happens to total surplus when a tax is involved? So you see here consumer and producer surplus with no tax, what we just looked at. So resources are calculated efficiently, or they're allocated, they're good to go. That total surplus is consumer plus producer. So when you introduce a tax, though, here's what happens. Taxes reduce, and this is extremely important to understand, taxes reduce producer and consumer surplus. Okay? Taxes reduce the consumer and the producer surplus. The elasticity of supply and demand will determine by how much. And then it also introduces, you'll see there in the red, the deadweight loss. So economically speaking, are taxes a good thing? And that's an interesting question. The government runs off taxation, but it also, of course, it makes the markets more inefficient. And so you have this constant give and take that has to happen within the economy. So if taxes increase too much, they become detrimental to the economy. At the same time, though, if the government just left the economy alone, the economy, market failures could occur. So there's always this balance of trying to do just enough but not do too much.